The wind shrieked through the pines like a living thing, carrying sheets of snow that blinded anyone foolish enough to be outside. It was the kind of storm that sent even the hardiest ranchers hurrying inside, but Caroline Hart urged her horse forward through the swirling white. At 23, the sheriff's daughter had inherited her father's stubbornness in full measure. She had a small bundle of medicine strapped to her saddle, and she wasn't about to let a little snowstorm keep her from reaching the Miller family. Their youngest girl had been burning with fever for days. At first, the trail was familiar, the creek crossing and the tall, lightning-scarred pine showing her the way. But the snow fell heavier, erasing every landmark she knew. Soon, even her horse struggled to push through the drifts, and a thin fear slipped into her chest. Caroline pulled her cloak tighter, but the cold found its way in, numbing her fingers and biting her toes. The wind howled harder, whipping at Buttercup's mane until the mare tossed her head in protest. "Easy, girl," Caroline whispered, though her own heart was pounding. She tried to turn back, but the trail was gone, buried under fresh snow. Behind her lay only white emptiness. Ahead, the storm swallowed everything. She pressed on, hoping to stumble across the Miller cabin, but each step carried her further into danger. Then it happened. Buttercup's hoof slipped into a hidden hollow. The mare cried out, pitching sideways. Caroline felt herself flung from the saddle, tumbling down a slope she hadn't even seen. Snow filled her mouth, her ears, the world turning into a blur of white and pain. Her head struck something hard, and everything went black. When she woke, she was half buried in the drift at the bottom of a ravine. Her ankle throbbed with sharp pain when she tried to move, and the world tilted dizzily. Buttercup was gone. Caroline tried to call out, but the storm stole her voice. She thought of her father, Sheriff Marshal Hart, miles away in the county seat. She thought of Martha at home, who would be pacing and worrying. She thought of the Millers, sick child, and the medicine now lost in the snow. The cold pressed closer, pulling at her eyelids, whispering for her to sleep. Caroline fought it, but she was so tired, so very tired. Miles away, Elias Crowe trudged through the snow with a bundle of empty traps slung over his shoulder. 32 years old, with broad shoulders and a thick beard, he was a man shaped by hard labor and harder years. He had built his cabin high on Thunder Peak to be left alone. For 3 years he had lived like a ghost, hiding from a past that had branded him an outlaw. The storm had driven every animal into hiding, leaving his traps bare. He was about to turn back when a flash of pale cloth against the snow caught his eye. He moved closer, hand instinctively brushing the revolver at his hip, but it wasn't danger he found. It was a woman lying half frozen, her hair crusted with ice, her lips nearly blue. For a moment Elias stood still, snow pelting his face, torn between caution and instinct. He had spent years avoiding strangers, especially those from town. One word about him in the law would ride hard to drag him to the gallows. But he couldn't leave her. Not like this. He bent and lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as glass, her breath faint against his neck. He carried her against his chest, pushing through the storm, until his cabin finally loomed out of the white. Inside, he laid her gently on his narrow bed. The fire in the stone hearth was low, but it was heat, and he piled on more wood until the flames roared. Her clothes were soaked through, stiff with ice. He worked quickly, stripping them away and wrapping her in every blanket he owned. He set her boots by the fire, checked her ankle with careful fingers, and bound it tight with strips of cloth. He brewed willow bark tea, hoping she'd wake enough to drink. Through it all, Elias kept glancing at her face. She was young, beautiful, even under the pallor of frostbite. Her features were delicate, but her jaw carried a strength that reminded him of the women who crossed mountains with their families, carving out lives where others wouldn't dare. What in God's name was she doing up here alone in such a storm? Hours passed. The storm battered the cabin walls, but inside the fire held steady. Elias sat by the bed, feeding the flames, listening to her faint breathing. Once she stirred, murmuring something he couldn't catch. He leaned closer, heart tightening at the sound of her voice. It had been 3 years since he had sat this near to another soul. 3 years since he had spoken more than a few words at a time. Watching her now, Elias felt something crack in his chest, something he had buried with his brother when they hanged him back in Billings. When morning came, Caroline woke to the warmth of heavy blankets and the scent of smoke. Her eyes fluttered open to rough-hewn beams above her head, a stone fireplace glowing bright, and the quiet figure of a man sitting nearby. She shifted, wincing as her ankle screamed in protest. "You're awake!" the deep voice said. She startled, pulling the blanket higher. The man rose from his chair, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair unkempt, his beard shadowing his face. His gray eyes studied her with cautious intensity. "Don't be afraid," he said gently. "Found you in the snow yesterday. You were near frozen." "Yesterday," Caroline whispered, throat dry. He poured water from a pot and handed it to her. Easy, small sips. She drank, studying him over the rim. His hands were rough but clean, his movements careful. He wore a worn shirt and boots, his revolver hanging on the wall. "Who are you?" she asked. "Name's Elias. This is my cabin." Caroline's gaze darted to the window. Outside was only white. Snow piled high, wind still whipping. "You'll not make it far in that storm," Elias said. "Best you rest." Caroline's heart pounded. She was alone in a strange man's cabin, wearing his clothes, her own garments drying by the fire. She didn't know who he was, only that he had saved her when no one else could. And Elias, watching her with eyes like winter steel, knew that the woman in his bed could bring the law down on him if she spoke his name in the wrong company. Yet as the firelight touched her face, he also knew one thing, with startling certainty. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel alone. Caroline Hart tried to calm her racing heart, though her eyes never left the stranger who had saved her. He moved with the quiet ease of a man used to being alone. Everything in the small cabin told the same story. A single chair, a narrow bed, tools lined neatly on the wall, food stores stacked carefully in wooden crates. This wasn't a family's home, it was the den of a solitary man. Elias set the cup down and pulled another log from the stack. He didn't crowd her. He seemed to know she was studying him, measuring him the way her father measured men in town. When the fire snapped, Caroline flinched, then scolded herself for being foolish. "I need to get back," she said after a long silence. Her voice shook, but she forced it steady. "My father will be worried, and there's a sick child waiting for medicine." "You won't get far," Elias replied, not unkindly. He pulled the heavy cloth curtain aside from the window. Outside the world was nothing but white, the snow still falling, drifts piling higher with every hour. You'd last 10 steps before the cold took you. "And your ankle won't hold." Caroline's throat tightened. He was right. Even breathing felt heavy in the cabin's warmth. Her ankle throbbed under the bandages, and outside was death. She had no choice but to stay. Her gaze flicked to the revolver hanging on the wall. She had grown up with guns, but this one, resting above the fire like an old friend, told her something about this man. He lived by it. Or, at least, he had before. Elias noticed her glance. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "You've nothing to fear from me. If I meant you harm, you wouldn't be here talking to me now." Caroline lowered her eyes. "Then why do you live out here, alone?" For the first time, a shadow crossed his face. "Because sometimes the world doesn't want men like me in it." The answer chilled her more than the storm. Still, he had tended her, fed her, saved her life. Her instincts told her he wasn't cruel. He carried some heavy past, yes, but cruelty wasn't in him. That evening, he served her a bowl of stew made from venison and onions. The taste was simple, but to Caroline, starved and weak, it was a feast. Elias sat across the room, eating quietly, his eyes on the fire. She found herself watching him in secret, trying to piece together the mystery. The storm raged on for days. By the second morning, Caroline could limp a few steps. She busied herself tidying what little there was to tidy, insisting she couldn't just lie in his bed while he did everything. He argued at first, but when he came in from chopping wood to find her sweeping the floor with a branch broom, he only shook his head and let her be. In those days, something unspoken grew between them. He taught her how to mend a snare, she cooked bread from his flour and lard. At night, she darned his socks by the fire while he sharpened his knife. It was the smallest kind of life, but it felt startlingly whole. Once, she caught him staring at her too long. His gray eyes softened. Then he looked away as if burned. Caroline's cheeks flushed, though she pretended not to notice. On the third night, as the wind screamed against the cabin walls, she asked about his family. For a long time, he didn't answer. Then his voice, low and rough, broke the silence. "My brother was hanged in Billings, said he robbed a bank, killed a guard. But Thomas wasn't that kind of man. He had a wife, a boy. He was good." Elias's fists tightened. "I tried to fight it. Found witnesses who swore he was somewhere else. Didn't matter. The law wanted someone to blame. They made me watch him swing." Caroline felt her breath catch. "I'm sorry," she whispered. 6 months later, Elias went on. "They came for me. Said I robbed a stagecoach, shot a man. Same trick, same lies. I was miles away, but it didn't matter. The law had decided." He looked up at her, his eyes like steel. "So I ran. Been running ever since Caroline's heart pounded. An outlaw. Her father's enemy. And yet here he was, the man who had saved her, who had shown her more respect than half the men in Redemption Creek." "I believe you," she said quietly. His eyes searched hers, disbelieving at first, then softening. "Why?" "Because you carried me out of the storm," she said. "A guilty man wouldn't risk himself for a stranger. A guilty man wouldn't sit by the fire watching over me when he could have left me to die." Their eyes held. For a long moment, the storm outside vanished, the fire between them the only sound. Something passed across the space, fragile and dangerous, like a spark waiting for air. Elias looked away first. He rose abruptly, pacing the small cabin. "When the snow clears, you'll go home. You'll tell them you found shelter in an empty cabin. Leave me out of it. You'll marry some respectable man and forget this ever happened." Caroline stood too, anger flaring despite her weak ankle. "And what if I don't want that life? What if I don't want to forget? You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Her voice shook, but not from fear. The outlaw and the sheriff's daughter stood facing each other in the firelight, the storm howling beyond the walls, both of them caught between duty and desire. Caroline felt her breath tremble as she whispered the words that sealed her fate. "I don't care what the law says. I only care about you." And in Elias's eyes, she saw the same truth, though he fought it with everything he had. "Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know." The storm broke 2 days later, leaving behind a world blanketed in white silence. Caroline stood at the cabin window, ankle bound tight but strong enough now to carry her weight. The snow sparkled in the morning sun, so pure and untouched it was hard to believe the world outside hadn't changed forever. Elias was outside chopping wood, his strong frame rising and falling with each swing of the axe. She watched him with a strange ache in her chest, knowing the time was near. The snow had settled enough for travel. Soon she would be expected back in Redemption Creek. Soon her father would ride into these mountains looking for her. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Caroline finally asked the question she had been holding back. "What will you do when the snow clears?" Elias stared into the flames. "The same thing I've done for 3 years. Keep moving, keep hiding." The law doesn't forgive, Caroline. It only hangs. And if I told you I wanted to stay? He looked at her then, truly looked, his gray eyes stormy with conflict. "You're the sheriff's daughter. Your life is in town, not in some outlaw's cabin. If your father knew where you've been." "My father doesn't own my heart," Caroline interrupted, her voice trembling but strong. "I do. And I'm telling you that my heart is here." Elias rose suddenly, running a hand through his dark hair. "You don't understand what you're risking. If anyone finds out, it won't just be scandal. It'll be the end of me." Caroline limped closer, each step burning in her ankle, but she didn't stop until she stood in front of him. "Then let me fight for you. The way you fought for me in the snow. Let me be your proof." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Elias's hand lifted, almost against his will, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. His touch lingered, rough but unbearably tender. Caroline leaned into it, and that was all it took. Their lips met in a kiss that was both desperate and gentle. A promise and a plea. It was as though the storm outside had broken something open in both of them, leaving only raw truth. He pulled her against him, her hands clutching his shirt, and the cabin around them seemed to fade. For a moment, there was no law, no sheriff, no wanted posters, only a man and a woman who had found each other in the most impossible place. When they finally pulled apart, Caroline's forehead rested against his chest, her voice a whisper. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." But the world didn't wait. 3 days later, riders came. First her father's deputy, then Doc Morrison, their voices calling out through the trees. Elias stiffened, reaching for his revolver. Caroline grabbed his arm number. "Please, trust me." He hesitated, torn between flight and surrender, then slowly set the gun on the table. Caroline limped to the door and opened it, calling out. Relief filled the men's faces when they saw her alive. But their eyes quickly shifted to Elias, standing behind her. Recognition sparked, and the word left Deputy Richards's lips like a cursed crow. Within minutes, shackles were locked around Elias's wrists. Caroline's protests filled the clearing, but the deputy's voice was grim. "He's wanted for robbery and murder, Miss Hart. There's a price on his head. He saved my life." Caroline shouted. "He's innocent. I'll swear it before the court. The ride back to town was a nightmare." Caroline was placed under Doc Morrison's watch, her father's men treating her like she had been corrupted by even breathing the same air as Elias. He rode shackled, head high, saying nothing. But his gray eyes found hers often, and each time she saw it. Love, mixed with the weight of certain doom. Redemption Creek greeted them with whispers. By the time they reached the jail, the whole town knew. The sheriff's daughter had been rescued, and the outlaw who had saved her was now caged inside the stone cells. The days that followed were filled with fire. Caroline faced scorn, gossip, and cruel words from townsfolk who judged her for staying with Elias. She didn't flinch. Each night she carried food to the jail, sitting by his cell, her hands pressed through the bars to his. "I'll save you," she told him fiercely. "I'll prove the truth." He only shook his head. "Don't waste your life on me, Caroline. The law doesn't bend." But Caroline Hart had her father's stubborn blood. She gathered statements, confronted witnesses, begged her father to investigate deeper. And Marshall Hart, torn between duty and love for his only daughter, began to see the cracks in the case against Elias. The trial came swift. The courtroom filled, eyes hungry for scandal. Caroline stood before them all, chin lifted. She told them Elias Crowe had saved her life, that he was no murderer, that love itself was on trial if they condemned him. The prosecutor sneered, twisting her words into shame. But Caroline's voice never wavered. And then, like a thunderclap in the storm, Sheriff Hart himself strode into the courtroom with evidence in hand. Records, testimony, proof that Elias had been framed, that the real killers walked free under protection of corrupt officials. The crowd erupted. The judge pounded for silence. And when the gavel fell, the charges against Elias Crowe were dismissed. Shackles fell away. Caroline rushed into his arms, sobbing as he held her tight, his lips pressed against her hair. Her father's eyes softened, weary but proud. "Seems the outlaw saved you," he said quietly. "And maybe you saved him too." Outside, the people of Redemption Creek whispered and gossiped, but Caroline didn't hear them. She had faced death in a blizzard, the the scorn of her neighbors, and the power of the law itself. None of it mattered now. She and Elias walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, the snow melting under a rare burst of sun. For the outlaw who saved her wanted more than thanks. And the sheriff's daughter gave him her heart.